And today we are really happy to have one of our research fellows. This is Laine Munir. She is an assistant professor at African Leadership University in the Global Challenges program, and she's also with us in the center where she works with us on some different projects. And currently it's a project we have on climate change and COVID-19 in collaboration with University Caledonian Glasgow. Did I say that right? Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland and Mzuzu University in Malawi. And so we're really happy to have Laine talk to us about a project that she's doing. She's been working on in mining in Rwanda. And I just want to mention before I hand it over to her that it's a really nice example of a researcher who is able to take her research interests and then adapt them to where she is. So she has an interest in natural resource use and conflict issues, and in particular, gender and women's issues around natural resource use. And she had done research in other locations. And when she came to us in Rwanda, she quickly, very impressively quickly, got up to speed on the landscape here with regards to mining and gender issues. And she's quite well connected now in that domain. And so we're really happy to welcome her here and tell us about her research. So welcome, Laine, and I'll turn it over to you. And the screen should already be ready for you to take over.
Great, thank you. I'll introduce myself without the slides first, and then I'll screen share when I jump into it. Thank you so much, Beth, and warm greetings to everyone from very sunny Kigali. Thank you for folks who are tuning in on a different time zone. I always appreciate that. So as Beth mentioned, my name is Dr. Laine Munir, and in contrast to a lot of folks on this call, I actually do not have my PhD in anything related to biological sciences or even quantitative methods. My PhD, I'm a social scientist, and my PhD is in law and politics, and my master's degree is in human rights. So I think I would fundamentally describe my work as looking at legal pluralism, which is different legal spheres in sub-Saharan Africa, and local and international politics. And then environmental conflict happens to be the context that I study. So at COEB, I rely very much on my biologically and quantitative driven colleagues who help complement my work, which is really qualitative social science. So thank you so much, Beth. And to give a little bit of background, when I moved to Rwanda 3 years ago in the spring of 2019, I was coming from a background in studying Nigerian oil politics. And as Rwanda does not have any oil, I very quickly had to pivot and look at an extractive resource that is pertinent to Rwanda's future moving forward. And so I landed on 3 T minerals. And the 3 Ts are the 3 main minerals that are necessary for the world's electronics and specifically for electric vehicles. So the 3 T minerals in Rwanda are really driving the planet's green economies. So that is now the natural resource that I study. And let me show my slides, and then we can jump into it. Okay, just a minute. Okay, here we go. Let me do it again. You know, I slide share 3 days a week as I teach, and I still need
I was gonna say.
I slide share 3 days a week as I teach online, and I still need a minute. Okay, here we go.
I just think it's not a human normal activity.
It's not, and I usually use Google Slides. Is this okay, Beth?
Yes, it looks
Okay,
good.
great. Here we go. So, to give a brief background, this research project is actually my first one that I have been a PI on, and it was very generously funded by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation in New York. And the Guggenheim Foundation funds research projects that study violence. So I was studying three types of violence: physical and economic and environmental. So that's what buttresses the funding. And so I spent last year collecting my data, and I am now writing up my results. So my goal, hopefully, is I think my presentation should maybe only last 20 to 30 minutes. And then I would really benefit if we had a really rich discussion, because I have 2 articles under review right now, but I still have another 2 that I haven't written yet. And so they're very much open to interpretation and to feedback. So that would be my goal for today. So my project for the Guggenheim Foundation is called Women, Conflict, and Modern Mining in Rwanda. And as a general overview for folks who aren't familiar with Rwanda's mining sector, so artisanal and informal mining has been going on here since at least the 1960s at the local level. And let me clarify some terms as I move forward. We typically use the word informal in place of illegal because illegal is stigmatizing. And we use the term artisanal to refer to types of mining that are done by hand with lots of manual labor and that are not highly mechanized. So with that in mind, Rwanda over the last especially 15 years or so has made a very concerted effort at the state level to close down small-scale artisanal and informal 3T mines in favor of formalizing and encouraging larger-scale mines that have greater technological capacity. So this is really a question of how do local communities and local environments fare during the process of moving from informal to formalized and larger mines in Rwanda. So I'm looking at how changes occur during this process of legalization and regulation of the mining sector in Rwanda. And so when I was looking at forms of violence, this is really about forms of security at the local level in mining communities. And I was interested in 3 forms of security. The first is economic. And the question was, how does the formalization of mining activities impact women's income and their long-term financial outcomes? And this was my first question because the literature tends to show, or I should say policy arguments tend to show, that formalization of mining improves people's income. And it improves people's income because formalized mining is more productive, and legalization entails protecting workers' rights and helping ensure that they get paid what they should and that they get paid on time. So I was looking at how does the process of formalization impact women's economic security. Then secondly, for those of you who are familiar with the research on conflict minerals, largely out of the DRC, we know that this is also part of the research on the resource curse. We know that historically minerals have been linked to gender violence. And there are ample examples across sub-Saharan Africa of how minerals have helped fund low-level conflicts and ongoing conflicts. And the research indicates that it works on 2 levels. Minerals are a commodity that can easily be sold and traded to fund armed conflict. And then the second finding that we know out of the resource curse literature is that minerals also tend to prolong the length of armed conflict and violence. So it starts it and it prolongs it. And then we know that, for example, in Congolese context, that there have been cases of rape used as a weapon of war around mine sites. And we know that sexual trafficking and sexual slavery is a problem around a lot of informal mine sites in the Congo. So I was really looking at this idea of how does the formalization of minerals impact women's experiences with gender-based violence. And another definition for folks who haven't worked with GBV literature before, gender-based violence is an umbrella term that includes sexual violence, but gender-based violence also includes what we call domestic violence or intimate partner violence. It includes sexual harassment, and it can even include environmental and economic violence. So I'm looking at it kind of with the umbrella term, not simply in terms of sexual attacks against women. And then my third question was, how does the formalization of the mining sector in Rwanda impact how women interact with the law? So my PhD is actually more in political and legal anthropology and looking at how women approach the law as a tool to resolve their conflicts. And I was looking at oil-based conflicts then, now I'm looking at mineral-based conflicts. So I'm interested in how this formalization impacts the agents who are supposed to protect women from illegal activity, how formalization changes the legal actors that women might approach when they have a conflict. How does formalization change the laws and or informal norms or customary laws on the ground? And customary law refers to the traditional law that existed before the arrival of Europeans in Africa. So how does formalization of minerals impact the legal planes that women have to navigate in their mineral-related conflicts? So last year, from January to April, my research team, I had 4 enumerators. We sampled 6 cases in all 5 provinces of Rwanda, and these are all in all 5 provinces. They were locations where mines are clustered or where there's high mining engagement in a small area. And that was partly logistical and also partly to show, I would say, if you're a social scientist, right, you're really interested in anomalous or extreme cases. And so these clusters served as extreme cases of mining, and they are also the focus of the state's formalization efforts. So they were a prudent choice. I always try to be aware of who my audience is, and I know we have folks today on the call who are botanists and primatologists and agriculturalists and water specialists. So if social science is not your base that you approach your work from, I just wanted to make a quick note on how this work does apply to a lot of what COEB does, in the sense that environmental changes, whether they're caused by the mining sector or climate change or any of the other topics that we work on, they impact men and women differently because men and women interact with the environment in different ways. So in a broad sweep, those who study gender in the environment find that gender-based relationships drive environmental interactions and management based on socially constructed gender roles. So we all know that in sub-Saharan Africa, women are responsible for water in the home. So therefore, they have a different form of interaction with water-based resources than the men in their home would. And we know that men tend to do the hunting. Men tend to engage in timber collection and sale. So therefore, in that sense, men have a very different environment interaction than women do with trees. And so those are examples of how socially constructed gender roles determine the way that men and women interact with their environment. And the last point that I think is really compelling, particularly in Rwanda. So Rwanda is the only sub-Saharan African country that I can think of, maybe South Africa, but I haven't read the South Africa law as closely as I have the Rwandan law. Under Rwandan law, if a husband and wife are married, the wife automatically has her name on land titles. So it is the only country I can think of in sub-Saharan Africa in which men and women legally own land at the same rates. Now, major caveat, of course, is that having your name on title to land is not the same thing as exercising decision-making capacity over how that land is used. And that's really a gap that we find in Rwanda, is that women might have their names titled, but that doesn't mean that they are determining how land is used. So that's something that we want to keep in mind in our work as we move forward. So my project, called Women, Conflict, and Modern Mining, WCMM, I use qualitative methods. So over the course of 4 months, my team conducted 60 one-on-one semi-structured interviews with women in mining communities. And about a third of these women were directly employed by the mining companies. About a third of them had indirect mining employment, meaning that they cooked the food or they transported goods that were used by miners, but they didn't directly get their salary from a mining company. And then about a third of them were engaged in agriculture or other work that was not from mining, but they still lived in a mining community and navigated a mining economy. And then in these 6 communities, we did 12 focus group discussions, 2 in each community. And we had 14 days of observation, 2 in each site, and then 2 in Kigali. And number 4, I want to add a caveat. So this is an example of having, I think, very optimistic approach in your methods that ends up not working out as you had hoped. So this ended up becoming a qualitative project, but at the beginning it was supposed to be a mapping project. And at these focus group discussions in these 6 communities, I had each woman drew her own hand-drawn map of her community to show me where mining operations were, where did she do her farming, where did she do her financial activities, where did she live, where had she been displaced. And my goal was to better understand how these women geospatially navigated their mining environments. And then each community also did a collaborative map in which they all came to agreement on how to visually depict the way that mining had changed their community over the last 10 years. But I really underestimated how abstract the activity of mapping would be. And the women that I worked with showed an incredible and a fascinating mastery of explaining how they navigated their communities, and they gave me such rich information. They really are experts on the land that they navigate every day, but it didn't translate as well as I would have liked onto paper. So as it stands now, the articles I have under review are just based on interviews, focus group discussions, and observations. I'm working with an ArcGIS specialist to translate my hand-drawn maps into an electronic version that can be better used for mapping data analysis. But that should probably, I shouldn't have that data probably until the end of this year. So for today, what I'm talking about is just based on the first 3. And I used a program called In Vivo, which is kind of the creme de la creme for qualitative data analysis. And I did what's essentially concept content analysis, which is quantifying the rate at which I coded all the data, the rate at which those codes emerge, and then the codes that are most frequent are therefore the most relevant, and you follow that line of inquiry. So I have a few interesting findings at this point, just based on the qualitative data and in vivo. Finding number 1 is the most relevant, and without question, any form of mining, period, is better than any form of income generation in any other sector, kind of period. So even the women who are having the best outcomes from agriculture still do not make as much money as the women who earn the least amount of money in mining. And which is one of the reasons why alternative livelihoods for women who are displaced by mining activities have not been very fruitful, because any sort of alternative livelihood still cannot compete with mining incomes. That being said, Men and women do not financially benefit from mining equally in any way. It's not even close. Men still make wildly more money than women in mining. And then even when you consider improved mining incomes, women still lack access to formal banking, which means they have a very difficult time taking out loans if they wanted to, for example, become their own mining subcontractors. Women still lack access to credit lines, even if they do have higher incomes from mining. And they still really struggle because they don't have the technical training or even maybe the confidence to move up the supply chain. So the other major finding is that women in Rwanda who are in the mining sector, they are always in the lowest paid jobs, cleaning and washing, and they really struggle to move up and have technologically advanced or supervisory roles. So when I say that women are benefiting financially from mining, I want to add that caveat. And finding number 2 actually very much surprised me. I was not ready for it. And actually the article that I'm working on at the end of this year is actually just about transactional sex. So we use the term transactional sex and sex work also as an umbrella term to refer to arrangements in which it's typically always women, it doesn't have to be, are engaging in sexual activities in exchange either for cash or for goods or services or for employment. And in my work, I always say that all transactional sex is always a form of gender-based violence because it is based on asymmetrical power relations. The woman who is giving the sexual activities is never rarely in a position to say no. So therefore, I like to point out that transactional sex is never symmetrical. There's always a power imbalance. And it is very, very common in the mining sector. And it's not terribly, I guess, shocking considering that in Rwanda, of people who are formally logged as mine employees, only 16% of miners in all of Rwanda are female. So anytime you have a male-dominated industry, you have sort of the challenge of these sort of relationships. Transactional sexual relationships are non-commercial, non-marital sexual relationships motivated by the exchange of material goods or other benefits. Because of power imbalances, it is never truly voluntary. And my findings in Rwanda indicate there are 3 circumstances under which there is transactional sex in the mining sector here. One is A, sex to get a job. B, sex to keep your job, which means your mining supervisor threatens to fire you if you do not engage in transactional sex. And then the one that I was not prepared for is transactional sex to have your pay released at the end of the month. So those are the only 3 conditions under which I found that my respondents engaged in transactional sex, but over a third of my respondents said that they knew of it happening or had engaged in it themselves. So finding number 3 shows that in general, mining formalization in Rwanda allows women to have better outcomes in legal mining operations, formalized ones, than they do in, I use the word illegal for clarity, but we often, if I was doing an article, I would say informal ones. However, this is not gender mainstreamed. Mining companies lack the specialists to promote gender inclusivity and gender equality on the ground, and there's not clear gender quotas for hiring and promotion. So in other words, let me sum up finding number 3. Laws on the books in Rwanda to protect women in the mining sector should theoretically be sufficient. The reason they are not actually improving most women's outcomes is because they are really only being adhered to by large formal mining companies, and that is a minority of women who work in mining in total in Rwanda. And still on the local level, the dominant laws and norms that determine how women are treated are based in customary and traditional law, and they're based in local stereotypes about women's capacities, and they're based much more in social norms. So for this slide on finding number 3, I would say it in a few words: social norms and traditional law are a far greater determinant of women's outcomes in mining than laws on the books, specifically at the federal level. And one of my papers is actually based just on finding number 3. And I find that in some conditions, the formalization of mining actually impedes women's access to justice for their mineral-related grievances, because women still prefer to turn to local leaders when they have a problem. And going to an HR department or going to a foreigner, if that's who is in a supervisory role at the mining company, is still very daunting for women if they are suffering from some form of marginalization within their mining company. So that's an issue of legal pluralism in which there's multiple legal planes, and women still exist kind of at the local traditional legal plane. And so there's a gap in their access to formalized legal protections. So those are my main 3 findings. And if I would love if in the discussion, if anyone wanted to directly relate this to any of your work or help infuse kind of, I guess, more of a quantitative or a technical approach to what I've just presented in a very qualitative manner. So thank you so much, and I'm very much open to any questions or comments that anyone might have.
Thank you, Laine. That was very, very interesting and thought-provoking. And I was just reflecting on we as biologists, when I was recently with my colleague and we were talking about identifying some species, and they have to use the sexual parts of the organisms. And my colleague was so surprised about it. And here, you know, I was thinking about you giving your talk, and a lot of the talk is around the role of sex also, and how gender plays out in natural resource use and management. So it's very interesting. And I especially appreciated the slide where you helped us understand the role of women and men and the importance of understanding that for how we manage and make policies and strategies for resource use, and how your work links to biodiversity in the environment. So thank you for that. So I'd like to open it up for questions and comments. It's nice to see there's a couple of comments. Thanks, Christina, for the comment you put into the chat. Any of you feel free to unmute and ask your question. Down below under the More button, you can go under Reactions and raise your hand, but you can also just go ahead and unmute if there's nobody talking, and ask your question or put it into the chat. So who would like to start? Any questions or comments? I see Vanna, you've got your hand up, so go ahead, welcome.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Laine Munir, for the good presentation. Gender-based violence is a serious issue, and I'm wondering if those people who suffer from gender-based violence receive justice, or if they said they don't.
The answer is no, they don't. But I wanna add, it's often because it's just never reported. So it's not fair to say that they're not receiving justice because no one is trying to protect them. What we found is women. Let me say this: I had 60 research participants. 1/3 of them openly said that they had experienced some form of gender-based violence because of mining operations. So the gender-based violence had to be in the mine or at the mine or on mining property, or it had to be while the women were walking to or from the mine, or the third category of how it could be caused by mining is that miners are paid in one lump sum on the last day of every month, which tends to lead to a lot of payday drinking and sexual transactions and other behaviors that are correlated with poor outcomes for women. And so the answer is these women mostly said, one, they didn't know who they would tell, especially in the issue of transactional sex, because half the time, much of the time, if it's your supervisor who is engaging in transactional sex with you, who can you possibly tell? So you didn't know who to tell. And it's especially problematic it's a double-edged sword, Vinat, because if you are a married woman who has suffered from gender-based violence because of mining operations, you often don't want to tell because of stigma and problems in your marriage. But then if you're a single woman, it's also harder to get justice because you don't have a male family member to help advocate for you. So the answer is no. What I will say is I did not, in my year of research, I've not come across a situation in which a woman reported gender-based violence and there was any sort of repercussion for the perpetrator. But I want to add that's because it goes largely unreported because of stigma and because of lack of reporting mechanisms.
Okay, great. I hope that answered your question, Vinat. Christina had a question. When you implemented the social mapping method, was there a difference between men and women?
Great question, Christina. If I had more time and money, I would have sampled men, but I only had women in my mapping workshops. If I could differentiate between the respondents, I think unsurprisingly, the women who engaged in agriculture for a living had obviously much more detailed areas on their maps for about where you plant certain crops, where the water is, and then also the women who worked at the mine obviously showed less understanding about agricultural areas and more understanding about mining areas where mineral veins were located and all those things, but that's not surprising. The differentiation that was surprising in the maps is that I had thought that perhaps older respondents would show a greater understanding of the total geography around their areas because they had had more years of walking and navigating and farming and mining, right? That's not the case. Younger respondents showed on their maps a much greater understanding of the whole area, and my possible explanations for this are if you are younger, you have the ability to walk farther more often. So if you are younger, you have walked more kilometers in your area recently since mining changed the environment. And if you're an older respondent, you did your walking 10 to 20 years ago, and the landscape has changed so much that you don't have the same understanding of it. But that's just my cursory hypothesis for why I have that age differential in the map detail.
Let's see, there's some other questions here. We have a question from Christine Gassingirwa. It is a pity if the gender-based violence is occurring in this industry, and yet we encourage girls to follow their interest in all industries and occupations. Is there no way such information can be shared with, so there's a ministry mentioned here, to investigate and take legal action to protect women in the mining career?
Marie-Christine, your comment is so timely, and I don't even think you know how timely your comment is. Just last month, I did a presentation of these findings for the Gender Monitoring Office. And for folks who are not familiar, Prof is the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion. And then the Gender Monitoring Office is a discrete, I would call it a partner agency that focuses mostly on research and advocacy. So it's a little bit more focused than all of Prof as a whole. And so I gave a report of these findings to the Gender Monitoring Office. And we are currently right now starting a partnership to help a gender mainstreaming initiative in the mining sector in Rwanda. Also, I would add, it looks like mining within 2 years will overtake tourism as the largest earner for GDP in Rwanda. So Rwanda is soon probably not going to be a tourism-driven economy, but a mineral-driven economy. And so with that in mind, Marie-Christine, what we're looking at is the multiple levels, the multiple entry points at which we can fix this issue of gender inequality in mining. And one of them is to increase the number of women who are studying mining at the University of Rwanda, programs, mentorship programs to help support women once they enter the mining sector. So the research, mostly in sociology, shows us that there's two places where women leave STEM fields. One is right after college, meaning that women graduate in STEM, but then they never get their career started. And the second is that when women, after they have their first child. And if you can retain women in STEM at those 2 points in their career trajectory, they will probably stay in STEM for their entire careers. So that's what I discovered with GMO. And then also next week, coincidentally on Thursday, I am hosting a stakeholder workshop with 50 attendees from 12 government agencies, in which an element of the workshop is how to improve women's outcomes in the mining sector. And Marie-Christine, our attendees are Prof, the gender of the GMO office, RDB, and other relevant agencies. So my answer to you is, I'm working on it along with my Rwandan collaborators, and hopefully we can have some tangible outcomes maybe in the next year or so. We are excited. This is pretty interesting for anyone who has a background in coffee and fair trade. The Gender Monitoring Office just implemented with their very first mine in Rwanda a gender equality seal. And essentially that means the mine has agreed to be inspected to ensure it is meeting standards for gender equality as outlined in Rwanda's national gender policy. And then if you get minerals, it's the Gafuri mine, and it has this gender equality seal, then you know that you are getting minerals in a way that hopefully helps as much as possible to minimize gender inequality. So I'm actually working really hard on helping spread this gender equality seal initiative. And it's really comparable, you know, to fair trade seals that we see on Rwandan coffee.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. I didn't know that that existed, so it's really nice to hear. So that was a great question. We have another great question from Dancil. She's asking, have you tried to look at the division of work in mining activities? Which specific tasks are given to women and which expose them?
Great question. And that is something that I have quantitative data on. So in general, in all of Rwanda, as I said, 16% of miners are women. At least 50% of them are mostly engaged in washing. So cleaning, so sweeping debris, picking up minerals that are askew, things that I would classify as like cleaning jobs, right? The second most common job is breaking up ore. So when you take out these big chunks of rock, there's typically a male miner who uses a pickaxe and really breaks up the big chunks. And then going down the line, then it's possible that a female miner would then break up the even smaller chunks. So the second most common job is, you would call it crushing. And then the third most common job is panning. And it's not as common as you would think because it takes an immense amount of upper body strength to hold up this pan, which weighs dozens of kilos for hours and hours on end. And then the next most common job that women had was often in administrative tasks, working in the front office. And in equal number, there were women who were in supervisory roles, for example, measuring and counting the number of bags that came out every day, basically measuring production. And taking roll of which miners had showed up early, things that require, I guess you can imagine, standing in a hard hat with a clipboard in your hand outside of a mine. In general, the major disparity is that women do not like to work, and when men don't want them, underground. So the major division in labor is tasks that are underground versus tasks that are above ground. And there's a couple of reasons. And of course, underground tasks pay the most and above ground tasks pay far less. And there's a couple of things. There's a lot of stigma for women who work in mining, which is why it tends to attract widows and single mothers because they're already economically vulnerable and stigmatized. But there's the idea that if women go underground, they will engage in transactional sex or be the victims of violence. And also that underground tasks are too physically demanding and women are not physically strong enough to do them. I need to put the brakes on that perception, because the reality is a very small number. If you look at all that a mining company does, a very small fraction of those jobs take an immense amount of muscle and body strength. The majority of jobs do not require a lot of physical strength, which is why the physical strength argument isn't a good reason, isn't a good excuse for why so few women work in mining.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dansia, for that great question. And it really is a good segue into the next question from Bernat, which is something that really needs to be tackled, is why do women earn less than men? Is it because they work on easier tasks?
So we also have to define easier, Vinat. So another message that I spread a lot in my work is that we tend to see men's tasks, manual tasks, as harder, but studies show us men also work fewer hours per day. So you have to decide how do you define strength? That's what I say a lot to my stakeholders. Is strength doing a really hard task 4 hours a day, or is strength doing a less physically demanding task 12 hours a day? Is that maybe harder, right? So it's how we define strength. So Vinat, to your question, if you ask the miners, they will say, yes, women earn less than men because women do easier tasks. That's not true, because the women work longer hours and they have the double shift and they take care of, family members after. But then also, Vinat, the feminist scholarship also tells us that when women take on a task, salaries go down. And that is a sweeping finding across all countries and across all sectors. We know that when women, for example, when women started entering the IT sector in even developed countries, average salaries went down. We know that in the US, when women became lab technicians, salaries went down. We know that when women became biologists, salaries went down. So it's twofold. It's that we think that tasks that women do are easier, so they deserve to be paid less. But then also women are not often, for numerous reasons, not allowed to take on tasks that would earn more money. So it's a bit of like, I guess, a negative feedback loop. Good question, Vinat. Great.
There's a comment from Christine Gassengira that she was interested in this workshop you're holding with she's part of an organization that deals with women in science, and that maybe I can connect you to on the side so you could talk to her about that. Oh yeah, you said you gave the email address. Great. And then, Vinant just gave his definition of the difficult task. So Ajid, I see your hand is up. Do you want to go ahead?
Oh, yes. I find it's hard to type my question. So my question is talking to environmental perspective. So women, as well as children, they are more exposed to air pollution. And this is they are washing. So those women breathe more dust compared to the others, likely they are more exposed to air pollution. So do you comment as well to a link between the gender-based violence and environment, or do government have any kind of greater legal protection which take into account the gender-based violence in their policies or intervention?
Ajid, I just want to bring you with me to my stakeholder meetings and have you repeat exactly what you just said. That's exactly what we're trying to do when we talk about gender mainstreaming. So not only because of their gender constructed tasks at mines, women are exposed to environmental dangers that men are not. So for example, women work with water more, and we know that certain forms of mining release mercury into water and poison water with mercury. So And then we also know that women live below the poverty line with greater frequency than men. Women have higher rates of poverty, which also means that women are less likely to have the money to get health care to fix their environmentally related health problems. Again, a negative feedback loop. So if I understood your question, Ajid, you were asking, is gender-based environmental dangers being taken into account during mining legalization and formalization in Rwanda?
Oh, yes. Yeah, like just including top policies and interventions, yeah, in Rwanda.
My answer is no. So not specifically, because what you're talking about, you're being so analytical, is relatively granular. So what's going on in Rwanda is you have the mining code of 2011, and then you have the national gender policy, and basically these two policies are being overlaid on each other. You can imagine like a Venn diagram essentially, and then you have women in mining in the middle between those two policies. But neither the mining code nor the gender policy are nuanced enough to take into account very granular outcomes such as women's exposure to environmental toxins and those sort of things like that. So when we have these two broad policies together, moving forward in the next 5 years, I think the priority needs to be to really refine that middle intersection to take into account exactly what you're doing. So what I would say is we are now at the beginning of this process, and what you're talking about is more detailed and really needs and must, it's very important and would be taken into account maybe a few years down the line. And it's really what I want to help do while I'm in Rwanda with my Rwandan colleagues. We really want to take into account exactly what you're saying. Gender-based differentials and how mining impacts men and women. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. There's another question from Dansila. Did you see women with children there? If yes, how kids are they taken care of to reduce vulnerability to pollution?
Great, Dansila. So we need to give a round of applause to Rwanda. There is essentially no cases of child minors anywhere in Rwanda, and everyone was horrified at my question about it. And I could not find any examples, even in past research, of there being a problem with child minors in Rwanda. And that's really a testament to the strength of Rwandan law, and it's really a testament also to the high rate of primary school education here, right? Because that's really an issue of if people's kids are in school, they have a reason to not send them to mine. So that is my answer to you. And then also Rwanda is one of a handful of African countries that has a specific law that prohibits pregnant women from engaging in mining work. So tangential, or not tangential, I would say parenthetically, I will add there are cases in Rwanda of that law being used to deny women access to underground jobs, and those women claimed that they were not pregnant, but that they were accused of being pregnant and denied jobs. So that's kind of like an unintended negative consequence. But in general, I would say when you're talking about children and pregnant women, I never saw a baby or a child at any mine, and nobody on my research team has ever seen a child or a baby in a mining area ever. So that's very good news. How kids taking care? Good question, Dansila. So I will add that there is a hierarchy of which minerals are most dangerous to local communities. So when I think about the research on which minerals are most dangerous in Africa, we know that gold is particularly dangerous because it releases high levels of mercury into waterways. So when you hear about children being harmed by mining, it's usually children drinking mercury-tainted water near gold mines, and that's more of an issue in Ghana and Tanzania and northern Nigeria. That's not an issue in Rwanda. I hope that answers Dansila's question.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. So there's another question in the chat from Jana, and she wrote, thank you for the excellent presentation. Do men and women have different access to personal protective equipment, such as boots?
Good question, Jana. And my answer is for men and women, full-time, formally employed by a mining company or a mining cooperative, the answer is no. What happens, though, is that all across mines in all of Africa, and particularly in Rwanda, we have to think about the number of seasonal miners. So the people that I worked with, most work for a mining company, but there are tens of thousands of miners across Africa who only do mining to supplement agricultural work, and they only do it in agricultural off-season. So those are called seasonal miners or seasonal temporary workers, right? And they are really the ones who are most in danger, because if you're not a full-time worker, you're less likely to get access to PPE. And Jenna, as you know, women do the majority of agricultural work in Africa, which means women are the majority of seasonal miners. So what I would say is I don't see a difference in access to PPT because of gender. I see a difference in access to PPT because of part-time versus seasonal status. And women tend to be seasonal workers and men tend to be full-time workers. So that would be kind of like a de facto difference in access, but not probably because of you're a woman, you don't get a helmet, not like that.
Great, I hope that answered your question, Jana. So let's see, those were the questions in the chat. Anybody else have a question they want to raise? Here, I'm just looking for other hands up. I don't see. I just want to ask a question to you, Laine, that I have. Do you predict that there any other natural resource sectors would be similar to the mining sector with regards to women? I'm thinking about agriculture or other domains, or are there certain indicators that would tell you or predict the ways that men and women would differ in a particular sector? I know you mentioned in the beginning of your talk that mining was typically dominated by men, and so that probably drives some of what we see today, but I'm wondering if there's any other areas you see in the natural resource use sector, any of these sectors here in Rwanda, for example.
Where you have gender inequality kind of structurally entrenched, Beth, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question, one theme that I see across all natural resources is women being clustered at the low end of the supply chain and men being clustered at the higher end of the supply chain. And specifically, we see that in the coffee industry in Rwanda. And maybe somebody who I actually just know mostly about coffee in Rwanda. I don't know about Rwanda's other agricultural exports. So that's number one, is the clustering of women in menial, low-paid jobs with very little autonomous decision-making capacity over that natural resource. I think that probably translates to a lot of natural resources. And then second of all, the article that I have under review right now is about cooperatives. And there's actually very little work. I actually found maybe 3 articles, period, on mining cooperatives that mentioned Rwanda. So a lot of the research I drew on is on agricultural cooperatives, and there's so much rich literature on agricultural cooperatives in Rwanda and neighboring countries. And the second theme that we found is that even when men and women join any cooperative, women very rarely take leadership position or engage in decision-making capacity within that cooperative. In the best of outcomes, according to the agricultural cooperative research, women vote, but there was essentially no research indicating that women were ever leaders in agricultural cooperatives, which actually is kind of similar to the supply chain finding, isn't it, right? That's really all about about women being there in numbers technically, but not actually determining outcomes of the organization. So if anybody's doing work on cooperatives, I would love to share that paper because it's still under review. And then the other issue that this has to do with conflict minerals is there's some really good work, Beth, on natural resources that are portable and lootable versus those that are not. So natural resource politics tells us that outcomes from oil and gas are different from outcomes of minerals because oil and gas cannot be easily stolen. It cannot be easily traded. It cannot be easily sold, right? No one is going to like walk away and steal a barrel of oil on their back, right? But minerals are very lootable, very portable. They're easy to sell. They act as a currency in a way that, say, oil and gas do not. So I think something that's really interesting for anyone on the call who also looks at like agricultural products is how conducive is your agricultural product to standing in for a currency? And how does its value as a currency impact the way that it is managed and treated and governed, right? I'm not an expert on these things, so I don't know how valuable a bag of yams is or how valuable a bag of coffee is. But that question of portability and lootability as a currency for agricultural products, I think is really compelling.
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. I saw Dancila is interested in getting in touch with you, and I think the two of you have known Dancila for quite a while, and I think both of you would make a great team together.
I love it.
So you could share your email with her if you wanted. I can also help you get in touch via